Hello and welcome to the 14th Annual Kosciuszko Spring Symposium. The focus of this year's virtual conference will be security, faith, and resilience in the Intermarium and beyond. Today's virtual symposium is organized by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 online MAs, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you are interested in learning more about us, please visit us at iwp.edu. We would like to thank to all of our supporters who make our IWP events program possible. To support the work of IWP, please visit iwp.edu/donate. Today we'll be hearing from Mr. Christopher Garbowski on his lecture titled The Lublin Triangle, the War in Ukraine and the Problem of Moral Rearmament. Christopher Garbowski is Professor Emeritus at Maria Curie-Skłodowska University, Poland. He is the author or co-editor of several books. Among them is Religious Life in Poland, History, Diversity, and Modern Issues from 2014. This led to several years as a book review editor at the Polish Review, and indirectly to a broader outlook on a number of matters pertaining to East Central Europe. His most recent book is The Problem of Moral Rearmament, Poland, the European Union, and the War in Ukraine, published in 2024. Please welcome Mr. Garbowski.
Hello, everyone. I feel happy to be addressing you with this lecture on such a special occasion. Sociologist Frank Furedi claims a pervasive culture of fear in the West marks this century, which includes various forms of competitive scaremongering and has a powerful effect on how the past is interpreted. As a result, the shift of focus from the historical hero to the survivor of history mirrors the trend towards the emergence of the fragile and vulnerable subject as the central character of the culture of fear, and leads to historical amnesia. In The Road to Ukraine of 2022, Furedi argues the cumulative result of historical amnesia, the neglect of the importance of traditional boundaries, both national and cultural, has been the moral disarmament of the West. He persuasively argues that, as important as rearming countries of the West may currently be, what matters now, today, is not so much military, but moral rearmament. Recovering a sense of historical consciousness is the precondition for the Western world to acquire the ability to play a mature and responsible role in global affairs. With the war in Ukraine, history has returned for national communities in Europe, with potentially further victims for the closest to the line of fire. And this raises the need for heroes, to say the least. The historical amnesia, which Furedi has diagnosed, inhibits the necessary moral rearmament needed to more effectively face the challenges the war of Ukraine has evoked. By and large, Europeans do not want to fight to defend their nations. For instance, according to a survey at this time, in the first quarter of 2025, only 17% of Germans are willing to fight for their country. Moreover, Furedi stresses that as a cultural trend, what moral disarmament tends to undermine, at times consciously, at others unconsciously, is the civilizational attributes of the Western world. Among these attributes, one could place patriotism as the virtue that cements national communities, as can be deduced from Alistair MacIntyre's Lindley Lecture of 1984, Is Patriotism a Virtue? One would think that among the places in Europe that this would not be a great problem would be in Poland, since awareness of history has played such an important role in creating the modern national character and fostering a tragic sense to assist in dealing with current mounting dangers. And this has been true to some extent. Yet it nevertheless does seem a significant portion of the present Polish meritocracy, like its historically less tried European counterparts, seems to similarly wish to provide evidence for political philosopher Michael Sandel's argument that the common good is not among its major concerns. I will argue in my lecture that at different levels, moral rearmament is a crucial concern within 3 countries of the Intermarium, that is Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, which at this point are also united in what is called the Lublin Triangle. Unlike the better-known 3 Seas initiative established in 2016 and that covers most countries of the Intermarium, although only EU member states, the 3 countries are equal members of the political unit established in 2020, while in the former, among others, because it is not a member state of the European Union, Ukraine is only an associate member. Although it must be conceded, the Lublin Triangle is hardly as important as the 3 Seas initiative. The levels of moral rearmament within the countries are different, among others, because there are obvious different levels of engagement in the war. In line with this, as national communities, historical consciousness and memory plays a role in creating their distinct sense of identity. As important as this is, there's also the problem of how the neighboring nations relate to each other and how their histories might have affected this. In my lecture, I will primarily focus on the latter question. There is a historical predecessor to the Lublin Triangle, and that is the Union of Lublin. And so the current mini-union reflects back to the heart of the Intermarium, which, as Maria Curie-Skłodowska states, conceptually harkens back to the Jagiellonian dynasty of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland in the 15th century. In 1569, the ruling classes of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania met in Lublin with their counterparts from the Kingdom of Poland to create the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was what finally resulted from a personal union dating back to 1386. The Lithuanians, a Baltic people, were attracted to the Poles because of the persecution by the Teutonic Knights, who converted pagans by force. Through the relatively more peaceful Christian Poles, they accepted the Catholic faith. Much like the future union of Scotland and England that created a single state, the Poles and Lithuanians formally united in what came to be known as the Union of Lublin, but they retained their separate identities. Somewhat more complicated was the relationship with the future Ukrainians. After the disintegration of Kievan Rus, the Eastern Slavic lands east of the Dnipro River became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and subsequently the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, that led to the division of Eastern Slavs, and since the Poles took control of the part of the population nearest to them. And so they basically initiated the divide into the future Belarusians and Ukrainians. And as Ukrainian historian Serhiy Yakelchik writes, unlike Muscovy, Poland professed religious tolerance. Muscovy, one can add, was not that far east of the border of the new polity, only becoming Russia in the 17th century. Significantly, Jakielczyk continues, Ukraine's historical relations with Poland and other Western neighbors had a profound and lasting effect. At this point, I wish to present the image of the castle chapel in Lublin from the time of the personal union, arguably one of the richest symbols of the Lublin Triangle. The personal union included a number of agreements that preceded the formal union. Among them was a preliminary act signed in Horodlo in 1413, which starts with an inspiring invocation. Whosoever is unsupported by the mystery of love shall not receive the grace of salvation. For by love laws are made, kingdoms governed, cities ordered, and the state of the commonweal is brought to its proper goal. Whosoever shall cast love aside shall lose everything. It is hard not to be touched by such high-mindedness. Obviously, once it emerged, a century and a half later, the new state did not exactly live up to the early intent to be governed by love. Nevertheless, although its failings were substantial enough, much that was valuable flourished for a time, in the long term, even partly informing the character of the Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian national communities that came more firmly into being centuries later. Love is among the intangibles of history, at least at the socio-political level. What is evident from the reference contained in the invocation, it is derived from the Christian nature of the emerging political community. This particular version of the political community was conceived shortly after the main threat had been met at the Battle of Grunwald, where the menacing Teutonic Knights were successfully confronted. The fight was also a legal one, since the losers, with their international status, challenged the legality of the opponent's victory on account of Lithuanian forces, including pagans, as well as a contingent of Muslim Tatar warriors. The victorious Polish-Lithuanian contingent was defended at the Papal Council of Constance several years later by Paweł Wojtkowicz, for whom the natural right to political independence held equally for pagans and Christians. The legal expert from the Jagiellonian University was vehemently against conversion by the sword that the Teutonic Knights practiced. It was not long after the victory that King Jagiello ordered the murals that were added to the Gothic chapel at the castle of Lublin. In juxtaposing the magnificent, predominantly Orthodox-style murals with the vaulting Gothic interior architecture, the entire chapel resonates to this day as a powerful symbol of the meeting of Eastern and Western Christianity, which at the time simply incorporated the serendipitous juncture of both religious cultures present in the kingdom through the whims of its patron, even though the leaders of the faith communities in Rome and Constantinople had mutually excommunicated each other a few centuries earlier. Pope John Paul II envisioned the two lungs of Western and Eastern Christendom working together. Even at this point, John Paul's vision is more prophetic than real, but beauty and symbolism such as are found in the chapel are among the means to keep their hope alive in the present. I will now look more closely at Poland and Lithuania. As close as some national communities are to each other, there are obvious differences along with at least occasional tensions. For instance, the question arises, if the early personal union had resemblances to the English-Scottish Union, then why did the Lithuanians keep their language? And the language question was real. Poles had a dominant political culture that was not so much imposed as respected by their Baltic partners. Even in the 20th century, Nobel laureate Czesław Miłosz reported that when he lived in Vilnius in the interwar period, with his friends he spoke Polish, but they considered themselves Lithuanian. This was because they considered the native language primitive. Initially, a fairly open political and legal system glued the nationalities together in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What had evolved was a republican commonwealth with a strong Sarmatian cultural base. In philosophical terms, as Eva Thompson puts it, Sarmatism was a pre-modern Polish cultural episteme built on the belief that at the center of human endeavors reside metaphysical realities rather than the desire for power, and that all human concerns should place second fiddle to those realities. Its Christian articulation provided the stimulus for Sarmatian creativity. Sarmatism is grounded in the idea of republicanism and is based on the virtue of the republic's citizens. Overall, the early Polish and Lithuanian nations were both more exclusive and more inclusive than modern nationalisms. As Timothy Snyder puts it, while modern nationalism demands a centralized state, the Commonwealth retained separate Polish and Lithuanian law codes and administrations. Exclusivity and inclusivity were also reflected in their approach towards language. Certainly, Polish did have a fairly large influence on Lithuanian noblemen, which changed during the period of the partitions, that is, after the late 18th century when the Commonwealth was divided between three partitioners. The Lithuanians were together with the Poles that found themselves in the Russian partition. For much of the period, Poles had a stronger position, among others in the educational system that they dominated in their part. However, that changed after the Polish uprising of 1863. For one thing, the Russians decided the Lithuanian students should study in St. Petersburg rather than Warsaw. Moreover, there was also greater Russification of the schools in the partition, and Russian culture was less attractive to Lithuanian students than Polish had been. What is more, the serfs were emancipated fairly late in the Russian partition, but they now created a new prosperous class of Lithuanian peasants. Altogether, in this late period, peasants of Lithuanian origin, déclassé Polish-speaking gentry who now learned Ukrainian, those educated in Russian universities of various political stripes, together with Roman classic priests, formed a Lithuanian national movement. What must also be noted, since the Russians considered the Polish elites a threat to their rule, the Lithuanian national movement in the late period of the partitions was, to some degree, welcomed as a politically useful counter. Different problems arose in the relationship between Poles and Ukrainians from that point on. The First World War, with the defeat and collapse of the Russian Empire, paved the way for the creation of Lithuanian and Polish nation-states in a modern manner. One of the bones of contention between the newly founded Polish and Lithuanian states at the time was Vilnius. Thus, after the Polish Bolshevik War of 1919 to 1920, and battles between the Polish and Lithuanian armies, Poland occupied the city. There was Polish patriotism present among a portion of elite families in Vilnius who had in mind the historical statehood of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania the new state could use. As Snyder puts it, in 1920, Pilsudski's federalism, the hope to revive the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, motivated the soldiers who took Vilno and brought it within the borders of the Polish national state. Nevertheless, taking the city by force of arms drove Lithuanian nationalists away from the primarily political and towards an ethnic understanding of the nation. With the outbreak of World War II, Shortly afterwards came the annexation of Lithuania by the Soviet Union in 1940. After the war, Vilnius became the capital of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. It didn't gain the quasi-independent status of Warsaw Pact countries, which obviously included Poland. But although much of the native intelligentsia of Lithuania and the other Baltic states was deported to the Soviet Union in 1940, in 1974, historian Joseph Rothschild noted the experience and memories of 2 interwar decades of independent statehood today sustain resistance to Russification, even by the native communist cadres, and oblige the authorities to tread with some care of local nationalistic sentiments. Russification included bringing many Russians into Lithuania and the remaining Baltic states. No doubt, quite a few of them came happily to a country of a higher standard of living and cultural resonance gained during the period of their independence. So, how does historical memory help in the moral rearmament of Poland and Lithuania as neighboring nations? We partly see this in 2020, when Poland and Lithuanians top officials marked the 610th anniversary of the Battle of Grunwald. According to the Polish president, the joint commemoration of the historic battle demonstrates Polish-Lithuanian and European friendship. For Poles and Lithuanians and their countries at the time, it was the beginning of a new reality of the state sealed with the blood shed together, which had great importance for the development of our nations and this part of Europe, President Duda stated. Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda added that the victory of the Polish-Lithuanian military units taught people to build their own statehood, defend their identity, independence, and values. The Battle of Grunwald is a constant reminder of the fact that we cannot allow history to repeat itself. We must find peaceful solutions to all problems and disputes and be ready to face all emerging threats, Nausėda stated. As it has been summarized by historian Wojciech Roszkowski in his extensive study of the Intermarium, there has been substantial progress in Polish-Lithuanian relations of late. Currently, both Poland and Lithuania are members of the Three Seas Initiative. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not. Shortly after the full-scale invasion of the country in February of 2022, Andrew Michta drew a conclusion from Ukraine's stubborn resistance that it had pushed the importance of national sovereignty front and center. And since international institutions could not stop Russia from invading Ukraine, he added, there is no substitute for hard power, and no nation can remain secure if it lacks a strong military, regardless of whether or not it belongs to a military alliance. For NATO has yet again defaulted to the United States to secure Europe. Half a decade before the second invasion, while many in the West were coming to terms with the hybrid war that continued, journalist James Kirchik insightfully claimed, Ukraine's fate is about far more than the destiny of one former Soviet republic. It concerns the destiny of Russia, Europe, and the universal right of self-determination. Among the bolder ideas that were laid out at the time by Poles on account of their close proximity to and admiration of Ukrainians was that of Marek Budzisz, a journalist and expert at strategy and future, an independent think tank. In his column for an online journal, Budzisz expressed the view that on account of current transformations, he felt a key historical juncture was approaching in the relations between the two nations that required bold, long-term thinking. He suggested something along the lines of working towards a federation binding the two states together. Unsurprisingly, such an original idea was considered too bold by some commentators. Michal Stech of the Jagiellonian Club, a Republican think tank, argued that, among other things, such a solution did not take into account the fact that the Ukrainians are asserting their own identity through the war, and on their part, such a federation would mean giving up quite a bit of that to a partner in a stronger position. Another matter was brought up by Stech was the probability of the historical dark cards in Ukrainian-Polish relations causing problems for some Poles, which we will explore since they have been brought up once the initial optimism concerning mutual relations declined. But as hinted earlier, there is also a rich history that binds Poles and Ukrainians. Worth stressing is that Ukrainian identity has deep historical roots, and this is undoubtedly in part the reason for the strength of their continued resistance. In the conflict in Ukraine, written shortly after the initial invasion and occupation of Crimea in 2014, Serhii Jakielczyk helps in understanding the actual history of the attacked country. With more than 4 centuries of common history within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, much of today's Ukraine shares more of its past within that polity than it does with Russia. When the Grand Duchy of Lithuania united with the Kingdom of Poland, formally in the 16th century, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was created, possessing a form of republican government with an elected monarchy, on account of print, it included a fairly modern literary and legal culture. Municipal self-government reached a number of cities, for instance, Kiev. The intellectual climate was also high, in part because of the Reformation and the competition it gave to Catholicism. In response, among the Orthodox Ukrainians, Petro Mohyla, himself educated in Paris, founded an Orthodox collegium, which later became the Kiev Academy. The Polish rule over Ukrainians was quite different from the imperialist Russian rule, to which ever-increasing parts of the Ukrainian populace ended up being subjugated to from the late 17th century onward, eventually with the result of its culture being banned within that polity. Part of the reason for the union within the union ended was on account of the Cossack uprising of 1648. Significantly, Cossacks were part of the Commonwealth military resources, but they were made up from Ukrainian peasantry as an alternative to serfdom. The tensions within the system led to the uprising, which further led to an alignment with Muscovy in 1658 that the voracious empire took advantage of to take over part of the Commonwealth lands in which the Ukrainians largely resided. The Ukrainian lands that remained under the Polish rule, and then that of the Habsburg Empire, received a different exercise of political culture than those under imperialist Russia, including what we would now call an emergent civil society towards the end, and Ukrainian cultural life flourished. This had lasting influence on the national community's identity. Even under Soviet rule, despite attempts to encourage closer ties with the elder Russian brother, as Jakielczyk expresses it, the long history of the Ukrainian national movement in eastern Galicia under Habsburg and Polish rule could not be undone. Much as in the case of Poland and Lithuania, a Ukrainian state did emerge after the conclusion of the First World War, and in a similar manner, it led to the terrible conflicts that affected nationalist movements within the nations. But Ukrainian independence was very brief, ending when Ukrainians managed to recover Kiev in 1920 but soon lost it to Bolshevik forces. This led to the enlargement of the Ukrainian SSR, with all the tragic consequences, most notably the Holodomor. This was the man-made famine through the collectivization of agriculture, in which during the interwar years, 5 to 7 million Ukrainian peasants lost their lives, making it one of the major genocides of the 20th century. As Mykola Ryabchuk notes, Soviet propaganda denied the fact of the event. It was a typical Orwellian non-event that could not be mentioned under any circumstances. In many cases, famine survivors were afraid to share their experience, even with their children, either in order to protect them from an inevitable and apparently useless confrontation with the Soviet system, or merely to escape the dreadful images of the past. Although not nearly as drastic, the same period also had a negative effect on Polish-Ukrainian relations. The Ukrainian minority in Poland was primarily located in the former Austrian partitions, that is Galicia, and the former Russian partition, that is Volhynia. A revanchist terrorist nationalist movement was also formed, that is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, in other words, OUN, which desired an independent Ukraine. Founded in Vienna in 1929, in Poland it engaged in terrorism and even murdered Ukrainians willing to cooperate with Poles. Although OUN was not a mass movement, the Polish state was not without blame for some of the conditions it created to make it increasingly popular. After the assassination of a couple of major political figures by the revanchist group, the state started a disproportional retaliation that significantly aggravated Polish-Ukrainian relations. As Norman Davies summarizes it, in the years which preceded the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 to 1941 and the German-Soviet War of 1941 to 1945, both the Poles and Ukrainians lost all hope of any common action against their mutual enemies. Indeed, the situation went from bad to worse as the war continued. During the course of the war, a group of Ukrainians, together with Stefan Bandera, formed the Ukrainian Insurrectionary Army, UPA for short, that spent the war fighting a three-sided battle for survival in the underground against the Red Army, the German Wehrmacht, and the Polish Home Army. Bandera himself ended up in prison most of the war when his group declared an independent Ukrainian state. After the war, he led a partisan movement against the Soviets and died in 1959. Once Ukraine gained its independence, after the end of the Cold War, Bandera was declared a hero on account of his struggle against the Soviets. One of the terrorist campaigns his group conducted independently of him in 1943 has had a major effect on Polish-Ukrainian relations, even during the current war in Ukraine. In spring 1943, UPA gained control of the Volhynian countryside from the Germans. They started the murder and expulsion of practically defenseless Polish minority. Throughout the year, UPA units killed Poles on an individual and collective basis wherever they were found. There were local Ukrainians who helped the partisans, but also those who risked and even lost their lives by warning or sheltering Poles. Somewhere between 40 to 60,000 Poles died. Ukrainian historian Bogdan Hud, who published a book in Polish dealing, among other matters, with the Volhynian ethnic cleansing, points out the that the massacres went beyond UPA terrorism. A major reason for this was the mass participation of local peasants in the event. This was on account of deep grudges against Polish landowners and local magistrates that went back generations. Hood discussed the problem with a Polish journalist who wondered how OUN could be counted as a heroic organization by Ukrainians, as if what UPA did was not taken into account. Although he condemned the massacres, Hood responded that in essence, UPA fought for Ukrainian independence and not primarily with Poles, and that is how the Ukrainians generally understand it. Hood also agreed that Poles should be allowed to exhume the victims of an ethnic cleansing, which has been brought up during the current war. Poles themselves would do well to look at the comparable case of the Polish peasant Jakub Szela, who in the 19th century led bands of serfs and slaughtered Polish landlords and nobility in Galicia at the instigation of the partitioners, who suspected the latter of planning an uprising. Even the instigators were surprised by the response. The peasants had been offered liberation from servitudes, so the response gave an idea as to how repressed they had felt. It is worth looking at the economic development of the Commonwealth for the roots of the broader problem. I presented the rich political life of the Commonwealth that was unmatched in much of Europe. For instance, the percentage of the population involved in democratic decision-making was unmatched in Western Europe. This was the case even with Britain, where it only equaled after the Commonwealth no longer existed. The main problem lay elsewhere, in its highly agrarian economy. For most of the polity's history, trade was the base of its wealth. The main exports were primary products and grain. This worked well enough until the 16th century, after which large markets for their grain declined. The whole situation also affected the matters for the serfs, and servitudes became increasingly burdensome. And after the partitions, this state lasted longest in the Russian partition, and the situation of the Ukrainian peasants remained the worst there. The victim of history cannot be the center of moral rearmament, but it cannot be ignored either. A rich source for Polish moral rearmament must be recovered and can be shared. Under communist totalitarianism, as well as during World War II, religion proved to be a key to surviving extreme trials. At this point, it is worth specifically exploring what Poles experienced during the period of Solidarity. Solidarity organized the first successful workers' strike in a communist country, creating a union, which was supposed to be redundant in a workers' paradise. The Polish philosopher and theologian, the Reverend Józef Tischner, addressed the trade union at the first Congress of Solidarity in Gdańsk in September of 1981. So many hopes in Poland were pinned on the movement, together with understandable fears. A problem of the communist system, Tischner stressed, was that work wasn't independent. He insisted that work can only reach such a state when it is governed by the conscience of the worker and the bonds created with other workers. Under the circumstances governing their lives, this involved risk. I believe that today we may lose everything, but if we succeed only in planting the idea of independent Polish work in the human conscience, we will have fulfilled our task, Tischner stated. Altogether, it can be seen that Solidarity and Tischner's teaching opened the way to what has been called a politics of virtue. The movement was inspired by John Paul II especially through his first visit to Poland, and that alongside his message, Poles also saw themselves in a different positive context. The Pope brought the meaning of the revolution to the world in his social encyclical Laborans Exercens of 1981, which promoted the universal message of the movement that the true solidarity creates an ethical community formed through virtue. The experience of solidarity at its different levels is what set the Polish society apart from its counterparts in the Soviet bloc. Jakielczyk sees knowledge of solidarity and the generally rebellious Polish experience of communism as having had a positive effect on Ukraine. Poland was so dangerous precisely because it was so close in terms of language and history. It has always been Ukraine's implicit alter ego, something we could have been, something we were not allowed to become. It was fitting that Western Ukrainians, considered politically unreliable in Soviet times, had better access to Poland. But even in Russified Kiev of the 1970s and 1980s, early 1980s, Poland was often the topic of quiet conversations in the kitchen. If Wałęsa could do it, maybe people's power was more than an empty slogan. Unfortunately, of late, Poles themselves have become increasingly forgetful of one of their seminal historical accomplishments. In an interview political philosopher Zbigniew Stawrowski gave in 2023, he noted a spectacular rebirth of solidarity after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. He claimed it was analogous to what happened when Solidarity was founded in 1980, with the difference that at that time solidarity spread in the Polish neighborhood, so to speak, while currently it was offered to the neighbors from the other side of the border. Poles discovered solidarity among themselves, since the greater part of the society had the same stance toward the awesome injustice that Ukrainians experienced. But Stawrowski also made certain to point out the profound level of solidarity that Ukrainians themselves were practicing at home, the experience of solidarity of those in which they risk their lives and die. The Ukrainians are already building their own extremely powerful narrative of the experience of solidarity, which they experience among themselves in the face of the greatest imaginable injustice. In other words, the criminal genocidal war. As Frank Ferretti put it in a recent interview, the West has become emptied of moral imagination. And so unless there is a vibrant spirit of solidarity where people are prepared to look after one another, it's very difficult to have a secure political and military environment. At this time, this likewise pertains to the Polish national community, with its intense political divisions, despite the lessons the country's history offers through the solidarity movement on building an ethical community that for a time reemerged with the outbreak of the war. Now, unfortunately, that time seems to be largely past. Can it be recovered? That is one of the challenges that requires moral rearmament with the aim of overcoming the barriers to unity at home. The sooner, the better. And it must also include the neighboring national communities, most appropriately through mutual efforts.